So, in my attempt to trace out and re-examine some of the functions, forms, meanings, elaborations, conclusions, results of a work that I performed in the 1980s called Displacements, that ended up really exceeding the boundaries of its location and its elaboration, and wound up becoming, part of the thread work of all of the different pieces that I've done as the so-called, discrete sections of my work have intertwined in interesting ways. In the course of tracing out that specific piece, if you can call it specific in any meaningful way, I ended up recounting these segments of work that I've done throughout the decades, and here is a quickly jotted list of them. That may or may not include all of the subgenres of the work that I've done, but beginning with a series of pieces that, as I stated in the last discussion, involved organizations of histories of collecting, including museum collecting, archaeological gatherings of materials and artifacts, tomb robbing. I had mentioned that this specific work began with the King Tutankhamun phenomenon in the late 70s, in which these treasures that had been originally what can even one say, unearthed and stolen by an archaeologist. Let's see if I can remember his name. Howard Carter and his patron, who sponsored this excavation, Lord Carnarvon, I believe was his name. These British archaeologists had spent considerable time and effort hunting down these treasures from Egyptian tombs, and stole them, and then pilfered them for the British Museum, and then in the 1970s, the tour of these treasures made the rounds, both in the United States and elsewhere, but here it was like an extraordinary phenomenon. And so I thought of these, stolen treasures as in some ways, orphaned artifacts, and that began the work that I had done in collections. So collections, that title, has a number of different connotations, just like Displacements. I won't get into all of them there. Sortings, came after that, directly out of, thinking about some of the issues involved in collecting. So you collect and then you sort, right? So you sort ancient history from modern history. You sort the Egyptians from other Africans. You sort the Hellenistic Greeks from the Hellenic Greeks. You sort maybe you sort Macedonians from Greeks. Maybe you certainly sort Persians from Semites. You certainly sort the Chinese from other Asian cultures. Well, maybe you don't. But anyway, the racial ramifications of sortings, should be obvious. But sortings exist in infrastructures of power that are ubiquitous in the way that we address issues of identity and social relevance, that include race, and that include gender, and that include different aspects of history and different constructs that science has come up with, but that also include ideas like ability, disability, intellectual ability. Early on in my life, I was sorted into what's sometimes called a gifted and talented program. It was called MGM when I was a child, but I wasn't explicitly sorted in other ways, although I was implicitly sorted because of certain limitations that I had in other aspects of my ability to perform certain tasks that were assumed in as basic functional abilities to perform, like for example handwriting. As you can see, this is my handwriting as it takes place in regular real time, meaning unless I spend a half an hour retracing this is more or less what a list is going to look like for me. So I had become interested in the way that we are sorted and the way that we fail to be sorted, and I had done several pieces that belonged to that trajectory of working, and it led me to all kinds of things later, particularly with assistance from the internet and the web. It's easy to find all kinds of interesting ways that people participate as as one would participate in game, leisure activity, all in addition to all of the official ways that one gets sorted. You can find all of these types of tests online. Every test is a sorting mechanism, right? So which Marvel character are you? What wild animal are you? What what is your Myers-Briggs personality type? All of these are acts of sorting. So given that I had wanted to lead up to this question that often occurs on the Myers-Briggs personality type test, which is, if you take this test, one of the questions you'll encounter is you are always looking for new and interesting opportunities, and you answer positively or negative to that statement, and that helps in the sorting process. So I always answered negatively to that question, and I usually get sorted into INFP. One of the reasons that I answer negatively to that question is because if I were always looking for new opportunities, I would never experience the wonder and excitement when a real conjunction occurs, in which maybe not so much opportunity, but an opening, a kind of invitation is experienced. And a lot of those moments feel like the impetus for the work that I'm really, really excited about doing. So in discussing displacements and this larger list of work that I've done, and the way that each one of these elements has become entangled in all of the others, and then thinking about that question on the Myers-Briggs, you are always looking for new and interesting opportunities. I'm thinking about a moment in 1995, and I was in Europe, and specifically I was in Amsterdam, and specifically within Amsterdam, I was in Vondel Park, which is a large grassy open park that has a sculpture collection and includes a Picasso bull's head that I think is a permanent sculpture. I think at this time, I may be misremembering, but I think there was some graffiti on the Picasso, and I guess they also gather and host non-permanent sculpture. So so when I was there in 1995, and I looked on the web just now, and I can't find any representations of it, but there was a gathering of these white sculpture Buddhas that were clearly Asian, and they were sitting in a lotus posture, and they were all performing the same mudra. And I can't remember how many Buddhas there were. I do remember that it was the prana mudra, so a kind of invitation to an opening of this synergetic life force, this healing, energizing activation. But I can't remember how many of them there were. I want to imagine that there were 8, but if I press my visual memory, it doesn't seem to me that there could have been that many. There were certainly more than 3, and I doubt that there were 4. But in any case, this collection, this gathering, this really a collection of Buddhas, it occurred to me was an opportunity to perform a piece, and I wanted to explore it in terms of collections, because it seemed to me that these Buddhas in this Dutch park in the middle of Amsterdam were orphans in some sense. Even perhaps I didn't imagine that they were original sculptures stolen from some location in Asia, but they're imitations of these sculptures, relocated to a place where there's spiritual and cultural historical relevance. It seemed very much a kind of like displacement. Now, I'm going to skip over sortings for a minute and come back to displacements. I had already begun displacements, as I said, in around 1986, or I can't remember the exact date, but in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, I had begun displacements, and that didn't mean that I had stopped doing work on collections and sortings, but it did mean that was for some time, a large focus in what I was doing. And seeing this row, this line of prana mudra meditating Buddhas clicked something, in my performance, activation, and inspired me to do work, because it clearly brought together these issues of orphaned artifacts that I had been working with collections, and the history of museums, and the history of art spaces and stolen art, and the idea of collecting and hoarding, and how un-Buddhist an idea that was. And with displacements, these Buddhas to me were clearly examples of displaced artifacts. They should have had a home elsewhere, somewhere in China perhaps, where they would be more comfortable with their ancestry and family relations. So I did a piece, and that piece involved imitating these imitated Buddhas. So At that time, I was around 30 years old, and I had closely cropped hair, which in the European summer sun had kind of turned a kind of Vincent van Gogh, reddish blonde. And I was thin, not starving, very healthy, but thin. And I thought that I made a good compliment to these. These were healthy looking Buddhas. They weren't either the jolly fat laughing Buddha, nor were they these emaciated self-depriving starved Buddhas. They were good, solid, sturdy middle path Buddhas. So I made a good compliment to them. So the performance was that I would go to the park and I would seat myself in this same position, in lotus position with the prana mudra, and I would imitate these imitations of Asian Buddhas. And so I want to narrate in a certain from a certain distance that activity and the way that this work brought together the ideas that I had been working on in collections with the ideas that I had begun in Displacements. Okay, so now the second part of the discussion of this piece takes us to a book by Thomas Kempis, who was a Dutch theologian who wrote about the idea of the early Christian model of Christianity as the imitation of the life of Christ. And it's an interesting volume, and it certainly bears upon history and ideas of Christianity that are profound, in some ways forgotten. I mean, in my understanding of Christianity, the early Christian historical period basically is a period in which apostles and devotees and followers of Christ in this idea, this religious idea of Christianity, did in fact live the experience of the life of Christ as a model, and that model included a number of different principles, principles of austerity. So you avoided lavish not only did you avoid a lavish lifestyle, but you avoided lavish display, so that your clothes were simple. You may have worn simple sandals or gone barefoot, and you may have chosen not to have a profession, but rather maintain your livelihood by means of charity. You certainly performed acts of martyrdom, and you certainly imitated Christ in your belief that you could heal through the use of the Holy Spirit. The early period of martyrdom was dependent upon persecution by the state and empire of Rome, so that when early Christianity was Romanized, this idea of modeling oneself as a martyr on the life of Christ was challenged, and that begins the second historical period of Christianity, in which those who are called the early church fathers and the early church mothers, because there were women among them as well, chose a life of seclusion and isolation. So as opposed to martyrdom. So you could say like that the life in life of Christ, that one of the that one of the, or just many, right? There were not just one, but some of the aspects of that life included martyrdom, as in crucifixion on the cross, so that many early Christians were martyred, not necessarily on the cross, but in other ways as well. People talk about being fed to lions and things like that. And then that was one aspect of that life, and another aspect of that life was healing and preaching. So walking through this landscape and teaching principles, right? And perhaps teaching them through parables, as Jesus did, and also healing through the Holy Spirit, because there's a profound belief in the Holy Spirit and the principles of what could be accomplished. The Holy Spirit as teacher, the Holy Spirit as healers, etc., as healer. So all of these functions were aspects of that imitation. Those were elements of that life. And then for the early Christian fathers and early Christian mothers, what became the keystone of life in the imitation of that life was seclusion. So going to a cave and performing meditation, very sort of Buddhist practice. This is very similar to those who followed the life of the Buddha. And there was this model in Buddhism as well as Christianity. So you say the Dharma was the teaching, and the Sangha was the school, the community, and then the Buddha then was the Buddha. But the Buddha, it wasn't just Buddha, Sangha, Buddha, Dharma. Buddha meant life of the Buddha, in the same way that this imitation of Christ meant life of Christ. So, like I was leading up to this next stage, that in the life of imitation of these early Christians, the next stage was that one moved to a cave or to some place of isolation and practiced in the wilderness. And this would include people like Saint Francis and Dominic and others, and who all found these places of social isolation, right, to perform meditation and to acquire these spiritual gifts, through austerities and an aloneness, like with God. And this would have been modeled on, in some ways, modeled on Christ's 40 days and nights in the desert, confronting Satan, I think is the term that's used, but this demon of lies and deception, as this final act of purging all sin. And I know that Catholic religious scholars will argue with me that Christ had no sin. I've always argued that if there were no sin, then there would have been no need to go to the desert and confront this demon, right, in this meditation. That's always like the final act of before attaining this deepened state of enlightenment and holiness. And the Buddha performs the same thing, right? In meditation beneath the tree, when he spends time. For the Buddha, it's not 40 days. There's not that 40, that value that comes from that Jewish symbolic value of 40. 40 days of the destruction of the world, and when waiting for a time when one that Noah could return to land. 40 days in the desert was was also a purging, right? The generation of slaves that had been born in Egypt had to die off before the Jews could enter their new homeland, right? So first of all, when Moses liberates himself from the ideological constraints of having been born into this situation where he's adopted by the oppressor and becomes part of this oppressive apparatus, he leaves Egypt and travels through the desert as an act of purging, but also as training, so that he can lead the Jews through the desert, and that they can survive. And this takes 40 years for them to pass through the desert. And the reason for that is presumably that it takes 40 years for the generation that had been born slaves and had this slave mentality to pass off and to pass away, so that a new generation raised in the wilderness and raised by the grace of the Creator's generosity in providing, right, manna and other sustenance in this hostile environment, in this wilderness that should be a place of death, can appreciate the freedom and the generosity of their God. And so this period of 40 years is profound in Jewish culture, not just Jewish mysticism. And I mean, it becomes part of popular culture in a variety of ways. Even I think it's part of a reference that Arlo Guthrie makes in a song called "The Paws of Mr. Claus," whose lyrics address the FBI, who certainly were a part of Arlo Guthrie's life, but in a kind of humorous way, makes reference to a period of 40 years. The lyrics include the following lines. Well, wait a minute, it's hard to be an FBI man. I mean, first of all, being an FBI man, you have to be 40 years old. And then Arlo Guthrie, pokes fun at, well, why 40 years? And he explains it not in terms of a process of like spiritual, purging of sin and spiritual practice, but rather he says, and the reason is that it takes at least 25 years with the organization to be that much of a bastard. It's true. So presumably like. You 15, roughly, like it wouldn't be 13, but roughly the age of, adulthood, and the sort of rite of passage into manhood, and then 50, if you translate 13 as 15 to get to 40, because he needs to get to 40, 25 years of training to be a bastard. So he sort of pokes fun of this idea, but that number 40 is certainly part of the rationale for the 40 days and nights in the desert. So it totally made sense that Jesus would perform this purging of sin for 40 days and nights, whereas for Buddha it's one night, addressing the demon Mara of illusion. But there's a parallelism there. And, when I discovered this Buddha, or this series of Buddhas in Amsterdam and Fondle Park, I thought about that connection between the imitation of the life of Christ, which would have been a Dutch thing, right? And the imitation of the life of the Buddha, which certainly wasn't a Dutch thing, but was very much a Buddhist thing. So So that connection was there for me, and further inspired the way that I wanted to address the way that I imitated the Buddha. So there were models for imitating the life of the Buddha, just like there were models for imitating the life of Christ, and the one that was the most obvious, and the one that made the connection for me between the two was this confrontation with Satan and or Mara, both demons of illusion and deception. It seemed to me, and so that I wanted to perform that aspect of this connection in relationship to the work of art as a displacement, and so what it is to be a Buddha, and what it is to be an artifact, and what authenticity is, and what stealing is, and what a right to possess is. And all of these issues I sort of wanted to raise, and I didn't want to do it over a period of 40 days. I wasn't that committed. I was committed enough. So in addition to the pieces that I did on a daily basis, which was to call attention to the sculpture, and I could address questions about my performance, in the daylight, for people. I also wanted to do this inner exploration, like I've talked about that before, art as experience. So I do work that raises these issues, based on my research and knowledge, but I also do work that brings experience to bear for myself, so that I don't pretend that I'm really confronting Mara in the same way that the Buddha did, but I wanted to have like some sense of what it is to meditate for a period of 24 hours, and to confront the psychological reality of this these unconscious forces that come to the surface in these like acts of extreme endurance, and these acts of mental challenge, right? So that was the model, or that conjunction of imitations of these holy men's lives was the model that I wanted to bring to the performance that I did as an imitation of one of these prana Buddhas. So in the Buddhist idea or ideal of the imitation of the life of Gautama Buddha, there certainly never was a historical period, in which part of that imitation included martyrdom. But the model was similar to the model adopted by the Desert Mothers and Fathers in the Christian tradition, was always leading a life of austerity, to some extent social isolation, and the embrace of lifelong practice of meditation, sometimes yogic meditation, and sometimes other forms. But in many instances, this form of the imitation of a life of holiness was practiced and performed in a space of isolation that was a cave. And the relevance of the cave as a depository of relics and artifacts. I combined, that's interesting, kind of Freudian slip. In relics, I combined the idea of artifacts, right? Artifacts would be like these types of collectibles that I was engaging in my first series of work collections. And relics are the embodiments of spiritual principles that are left behind in corporeal form when a holy one passes. And these are still important in certain traditions, particularly Tibetan traditions, but other Buddhist traditions as well, and they had been important in certain Christian traditions, include relics of holy people that further tie the idea of spiritual practice in the space of isolation and solitude in the cavern to the cave as the initial holding place of these valuables and collectibles, just as tombs had been holding places of artifacts of value, gold and other symbols of immortality and eternity that were later plundered by archaeologists and treasure hunters. So to emphasize this idea of the imitation of the life of the Buddha, these principles of what that life stood for. I'll read the end of a Tibetan monk Milarepa's life story, and it's a lengthy passage, but I think all of it is relevant to the piece. The Jetson replies, it is permissible if there is not, Milarepa is responding to this question, is it permissible to undertake some minor activities in the world if they benefit others? The Jetson replied, it is permissible if there is not the slightest inclination for one's own desires, but that is difficult. Those who hanker after the things of this life are unable to benefit even themselves, much less others. That would be like a man drowning in a swift current, saying he would save another drowning man. Until you have realized the abiding nature of things, do not act hastily to benefit others. That would be like the blind leading the blind, and you would risk being swept away by desires. There will be no end to sentient beings for as long as space endures. So if you are able to practice, the time will come for you to benefit beings. Until then, aspire to attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Well, other countries would say he's the last guy. Screw him. But in America, there is no discrimination. And there is no hypocrisy. Because they'll get anybody. And that's a wonderful thing about America. And that's why tonight, I'd like to dedicate it to every young man in the audience.
That would be like the blind leading the blind, and you would risk being swept away by desires. There will be no end to sentient beings for as long as space endures.
So you can't get up and say nothing, because otherwise you got to get sent back.
So if you practice, if you are able to practice, the time will come for you to benefit beings. Until then, aspire to attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. Holding others more dearly than oneself. Be humble in conduct. Wear ragged clothes. Renounce all thoughts of food, clothing, or conversation. Practice while enduring physical hardship and mental adversity. This itself will benefit sentient beings. In order to set yourself upon the path to practice, keep all of this in mind. And then he sings a song. And instead of singing that song, I'm allowing Arlo Guthrie to sing The Pause of Mr. Claus.
pacifist. What's in the pipe that is smoking? Mr. Frost is in your outside. He must be a dope fiend to put you uptight. Why do please guys sit on these guys?
And then the text of the narrative of the life of Milarepa, after he finishes the song, the last verse in the song is, "Myself, the Buddha, and disciples, these three, I pray they become one inseparably." And then it states, when he finished, the Jetsun added, "I do not know if I shall live much longer. Now that you have listened to me, do as I have done. Follow my example. Follow my example." So he repeats that twice. And of course, the example that he's referring to is itself an imitation of the life of the Buddha and the life that he's led, eating these nettles. Which is the mass of his food source. Milarepa's food source is these nettles that he finds growing wild near his cave in the cliff of this mountain, and he sustains himself eating these nettles, which he has one single bowl that he uses to cook and eat these nettles in, and towards the end of his life, this bowl is so fragile because the nettles have become part of its exterior surface, and it's so fragile that it's practically nettles itself, just like Milarepa has become part of this environment that he's spent his life meditating in this profound austerity. So these are the principles that he asks his disciples to embody, so that they become one with him and that he becomes one with them. And it's not unlike, in a certain sense, the model that was advocated in different contexts for different kinds of holy men. So so that model of imitation is certainly there, and is there in an extraordinarily extraordinarily profound way, and then it brings us to this locus, this space of the cave. And the cave is, interestingly, the place that both provides the theater for this transformation through austerity, through meditation, through isolation into a holy one, and provides the space that stores the relics, right, and artifacts of such holiness. So the cave typically becomes the sacred space, the not a temenos, but rather a place that became holy by the touch, when one could say, of the Holy One, more as darshan almost. The cave has eyes. The cave is eyes in a certain sense, because it was the womb of the birthing of the sacred. So the cave, one could say, almost is like the mother of God, the holy place, the chamber from which the spirit was birthed, and then becomes still like the home, the temple of the spirit, that was born there. And so typically, in China and other parts of Asia and Tibet, these caves become these depositories, these of relics and sacred objects and devotional acts, right? So you make pilgrimages to them as one would make a pilgrimage to a holy mountain, or another holy place. And so So I had thought about these statues in Vondel Park as being displaced from their proper location in a cave somewhere in China or somewhere else, and that these orphaned holy artifacts had been brought to the Netherlands, brought to Amsterdam, and placed on display as one would place, as not one would, but as tomb robbers, had brought these artifacts of Tutankhamun, or this practice of sort of colonial acquisition, right? This practice of colonial acquisition, and that included spiritual acquisitions as well. The cave could provide me with, or this act of meditation and imagining a cave could provide me with a way to address both those material concerns that I had been interested in, and this particular moment and meaning in the meditative practice of Buddha and further imitations of Buddha. So these statues were imitations of Buddha, and I would perform an imitation of Buddha, and I was investing in the story of the way that lives imitated the Buddha, and bringing all of this to bear upon these issues that had been of concern to me for a number of years. So, lest anyone think that I'm exaggerating the way that European and Western colonialists have regarded these caverns, these sacred caverns and temples, as well as various kinds of tombs, as sort of stomping grounds for exploitation and the theft of artifacts. I found a quotation from a British writer and anthropologist named Richard Carnac Temple. Interesting that his name is Temple, isn't it? From 1894. And this description is referring to a particular cave called Cave of the 10,000 Buddhas in Myanmar. And, Myanmar will be familiar to my audience from recent events, political events, occurring in Myanmar that involve the seizure of power by the military following the loss of Aung San Suu Kyi's democratic bid for presidency, in which she won by a landslide, and then the opposition party and the military junta kidnapped her and took control of the government, and is now falsifying charges against her to persecute her from these charges range from anything from misuse of information and violating statutes concerning political communications with individuals and governments outside of the nation of Myanmar, to charges of genocide, which all seem to be fabrications of this rightist government. I mean, much in the same way that Trump falsified information regarding his opponent and his son Hunter Biden, and attempted this kind of unjustified, investigation, and deployed aspects of the government, including the Justice Department, former General Michael Flynn, who's been involved in these kinds of conspiracy theories. In fact, I think Flynn, wasn't it Flynn, who suggested that the coup that was staged by the military in Myanmar could be replicated here in the United States. So obviously, a lot of the fascist forces around the world use the same types of strategy. So in any case, this cave, the cave of the 10,000 Buddhas in Myanmar, houses these types of sacred artifacts that I've been referring to, and in case anyone doubts that Western culture has seen these places as sites for potential exploitation. This is a quote from Richard Carnac Temple from 1894 regarding the artifacts in this particular temple. And he writes, everywhere on the floor, overhead and in the jutting points, and on the stalactite festoons on the roof, are crowded together images of Gautama, the offerings of successive ages. Some are perfectly gilded, others encrusted with calcareous matter, some fallen, some yet sound, others molded, others just erected. Some of these are of stupendous size, some not larger than one's finger, and some of all the intermediate sizes, marble, stone, wood, brick, and clay. A ship of 500 tons could not carry away the half of them. So what interests me, of course, is that he finds it necessary to conclude with this final statement: a ship of 500 tons could not carry away the half of them. So obviously he had thought about taking these objects, and returning them to England with him, and it's not an atypical sentiment. So the idea of these caves as depositories of treasures, right? And a lot of them are referred to as the treasures that these caves hold. And these treasures can be exploited in a variety of ways. They can be exploited by shipping the objects that they contain to Europe for display in museums. They can be exploited they can be politically exploited. They can be exploited in other ways as well. So all of these ideas were gathering in my mind about the way that I wanted to perform in front of these Buddhas with their mudras.